Skillful Samsara. This is episode 2 of our introductory broadcast, a podcast where we look at the events in the world around us and what's happening on the global stage through the eyes of a meditator. And joining me again today is Otto of Navakavada Buddhism. Welcome, Otto. Thank you so much for being with me again today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it greatly.
So, Otto, we've had some interesting news in New Zealand in the last couple of days. There was a system that was put into place here in the education system in the early 2000s where they stopped doing examinations, and things were changed and people were allowed to choose their subjects and choose their area of study, and they were graded by having achieved, not getting an A, B or C grade. And the government and the reviews have found out that it doesn't work and that our country is falling behind in terms of education. And they're doing a sweeping review to abolish all of that and to re-establish an old-fashioned system hierarchy of education system. And I know that you have also had some amazingly big changes in your education plans and things over in America. And I was wondering if you'd like to just say a few words today on what you think the state of education is and what you think our responsibility as individuals within a society is towards the education of our youngsters.
Well, it's interesting that the New Zealand government has decided that this wasn't, something that's working. If you don't have a grading system, how do you know how well someone's doing? How do you have any sort of incentive to try to excel? And of course, some people are going to excel, which means that some people are not going to excel. So it seems to me that, education should be to provide the best education within an individual's ability to, receive that education as possible. So here in the States, we haven't so much we've had some changes to education, but we had something that happened back in the 1970s. I believe it was under Jimmy Carter, who was celebrated in the Simpsons television show as history's worst president, or something like history's greatest monster, I think they called him. And he does have a very mixed kind of his legacy. But he established the federal government Department of Education. Now, up to that time, each state, and people don't understand this about the United States, the individual states create the federal government. The federal government does not create the states. The federal government's power over these states is very limited. However, the federal government does have a lot of money and distributes a lot of money to the states. And so what they did was they created the Department of Education, and what they usually do is they make being in compliance with whatever standards the government sets it's a prerequisite to receiving the money. We had something similar happen with seatbelts in this country. 49 out of 50 states require seatbelt use. The federal government decided that they wanted everyone in the country to wear seatbelts, but the federal government cannot make that law. That's up to individual states. So what they did was they passed a thing and said, basically, if you want to get any of the billions of dollars in federal highway funds, you have to pass this law. We will only give money to states that pass this. 49 out of 50 states passed it in order to get the money. One state did not, New Hampshire. There are no seatbelt laws in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire said, screw you, keep your money. Their state motto is live free or die. And so they decided not to have seatbelt laws. So in the same way, by holding the purse strings, the federal government manages to, control a lot of stuff nationwide. And so up until the time of the Federal Department of Education, each state had its own state level Board of Education, and education was handled very much at a state and local level. States had control over their state, and local school zones, local schools had basically a lot of control over their curriculum. And they found was that when now under the old system, some states did very well on how well they educated the children. Other states did not do as well. So the federal government said, well, we're going to make everybody do well. So they came in and they started pushing standardized testing, very standardized testing. And we started to creep into something called basically teaching to testing, where basically the students would be drilled in such a way that they could pass the tests, and the better they did on the tests, the better the school did. And then, of course, they discovered if they made the tests less difficult, they could score even higher. And basically what they found was that rather than the schools that didn't do so well achieving the heights that the schools that did do well achieved, everything kind of got pulled downward. And education scores started going down throughout the country. And indeed, you can show that basically the quality of education in this country has been deteriorating steadily ever since the federal government got involved in education. So for a long time, there have been a lot of people in this country calling for doing away with the Department of Education because we did just fine before. And in fact, when education was under state control, different states had a reason to compete with each other. And we're kind of finding that now. Some of this, I've heard it called the Southern Miracle. There are some southern states that have been moving away from the kind of quote-unquote education that you were describing about in New Zealand, where you basically, grade people differently depending upon their backgrounds, and well, it's too hard for these kids, and keep giving them passing grades. They return to basically you have to be able to grasp everything, all the subject matter before you're allowed to graduate to a higher grade, and insisting upon, demonstrated ability and basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And their schools are doing quite well. So a lot of other schools are looking at this and saying, hey, we can do this too, but it goes against political correctness. It goes against a lot of so-called DEI, or DIE, as I've sometimes heard it called, which says that that's simply not fair, that you can allow some students to do better than other students. And yet the results are pretty obvious. But the thing is, without the federal government pushing this sort of system on individual states can decide to pursue their own ideas about education. And the hope is that we'll return to the higher scores, the higher grades, and the better educated children we had before the federal government got involved. I mean, I think you can, I know that, causation is not, proven by correlation or whatever, but still, you can point to specific things that were done to degrade our ability to teach children. Another big thing happening in our country is a fight between who gets to control children, parents or the school. And I have heard teachers say that parents should not be allowed to raise their own children. They shouldn't be allowed to teach their kids because, of course, they're very likely going to teach kids that the parents agree with. And these teachers do not agree with the parents. Now, in many cases, these teachers have no children of their own. So they have to instill their ideas in other people's children. I think part of them know, well, when they die, they have no children. Therefore, they can't pass on their ideas. So they have to take other people's children. And, hey, have your own kids. If you want to raise them that way, you raise them that way. But you shouldn't be allowed to raise other people's. And it's really been frightening that this assumption on many levels of, well, no, parents can't be in charge of their children's education or in charge of the beliefs instilled in their children, because after all, they're not experts. I think I told you the story when I worked at an art gallery, and this woman came in, and I think I probably told you the story more than once, came in with a little friend of hers, and she wanted to look at the art on the wall. And I showed her some art. She's like, this is terrible. And she would give me why it was bad. And I'm like, all right. We went through all these different artists, all these different styles. I took her into another room. Every single painting, we probably had, 40 or 50 paintings on the wall. Everyone was wrong. It was bad. And meanwhile, her little friend never got a word edgewise. So finally, I was making small talk, and I said, well, are either of you ladies artists? And the little quiet friend was about to say something. She didn't say a word the whole time. But before she could speak, the talkative one said, She doesn't. She's not an artist, but I am. I have a degree in art. And she later told me she was an art teacher. And I just thought, her poor pupils. Her poor pupils.
Yeah.
You know? That same attitude, well, unless you have letters after your name, what you think doesn't matter. I know better. And you don't know how to raise your children. And, you know, all these things that we want your children to believe, it's what I believe. And therefore, you know, with letters after my name, that has to be a better belief than you have. So, it's something that, there's been a lot of fighting against that lately.
It seems that you're implying that you believe that homeschooling is the way of the future, Otto. Do you think that would be the resolution of the education crisis in society, is for parents to be responsible for their child's education themselves?
Well, that I think in many ways is ideal, but only for certain people. Not everybody is equipped to give their children that kind of an education. I think that for most children, they can get a decent education at home up to a certain age. And for the people that have the time and resources, and I mean, there's so many things you learn at home besides reading, writing, and arithmetic. You know, you learn how to function as a human being. Children used to walk around with the adults all day, help the adults out with things, learn how to behave themselves in different situations, learn how to cope with things by being around their parents. And this is an important part of education. And I think that children go to school way too early as far as that goes. But for people that are able to, schooling at home, I think, is a fine idea. But for people who are not, it's simply a question of local communities getting control of their schools again. You know, we had this terrible trend in the States here of merging school districts. So instead of a school district just serving a couple of villages nearby, the idea is, well, it's cheaper if we just merge them all into one giant school district and we get school buses, you know, hauling kids all over the place. So you get more and more school districts incorporated, bigger and bigger schools, larger and larger class sizes. And of course, the incredible growth of the administrative part of schooling, principals and assistant principals and directors and counselors and this and that, and assistants to the assistants. And then all the directives come down from above. It's one big uniform school.
Yes.
Whereas at one time, the local community very much had control over the school. The local community used to hire the teacher. And if the teacher was not, did not fulfill the community's needs, that teacher got fired and they would hire another one. It was in the hands of the community. So I tend towards balkanization. I think the smaller the unit, the greater the greater its ability to be flexible and respond to the needs and the wants of the people living locally. You know, a small group can vote on what it wants to do. I don't see why someone in the state capitol voting on something should impose their ideas on a small community when it comes to something like how you want your children educated. So, I think the smaller the unit, the more responsive it is, and the more you have, unless you have some sort of way to make someone answerable. And that's one of the problems when they privatize things. They were trying to privatize water in the city I lived in once. And it was very unpopular because instead of being, when the city did the water, you can go to City Hall and the people running it was the mayor and other people that were elected officials. You know, so if they got something wrong, they had to, answer directly to people. Whereas privatized, well, there was some kind of a liaison with the city, and he was the guy. And I mean, you could complain to the city government, but all they could do is, well, we'll pass it on to this corporation, and you can't vote to threaten the corporate officers with, well, we won't vote for you next year. They don't care, So there's that accountability factor. Is a big part of that. And the smaller the grouping, the smaller the area of administration, the greater the ability for people to have direct control over their lives. And it's easier to get accountability that way in smaller groups, and consensus for that matter as well.
Indeed. Well, Otto, thank you very much indeed for that. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time today, but thank you for coming and joining me today. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. And thank you, everybody else, for joining us. And Otto, any final words before we sign off?
I'll just, everyone, keep breathing. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Roberta. I always love being on the show.
Thank you so much. Yes, good advice, Otto. I will be breathing until next week.
Excellent.
Goodbye.
I hope so. Bye-bye.